Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us here today. We are here today to talk about a really interesting topic around where are the students we see. My name is Murray Simpson. I'm the Chief Growth Officer for a company called NetNatives, and we've been doing a large research piece into student perceptions of how represented they feel in the student advertising space. I'm going to be chairing our panel today, and we're going to be discussing a whole sample of findings for you. I'm also joined by two of my colleagues who I'm going to hand over to introduce themselves.
Thanks. So I'm Cass, Director of Research at NetNatives, and I've been conducting research in the higher education sector for over 5 years now. I'm working on things from identifying nationwide personas that are used across university marketing campaigns, all the way to working with government bodies on international student recruitment strategies. I led on the research that we're going to be going through today, so we're really excited to share it with you.
I'm Charlie, I'm NetNatives Creative Director. I've worked at NetNatives for 5 and a bit years. I've worked in and around the student marketing space for nearly 10 years. In that time, I've worked with universities around the world like NYU, Carnegie Mellon, London South Bank, as well as study brands like Study in Sweden on developing their own brand strategies, content strategies, and creative strategies. So I'm really looking forward to talking about implementing some of the findings, responding to some of the findings that Cass and Murray are talking about today.
Great, thank you, Charlie. So we're going to jump into the slides and kick off the presentation. So we've worked with over 150 institutions globally, supporting them in their marketing and admissions efforts, and from advertising in India all the way through to raising awareness in low participation neighbourhoods. We've worked really closely with institutions over the last 12 years to help them grow through devising marketing and recruitment campaigns that generate high quality students who not only enrol but actually stay and graduate successfully, which we know is a real challenge, particularly in the US when it comes to students dropping out once they've started. Now, as part of this research, we were really interested to find out student perceptions, particularly this year. And we conducted a deep dive survey with over 700 students to really understand how they feel about the advertising they see every day, how they're being represented, and how that makes them feel about brands. We also ran focus groups on student perceptions around the Black Lives Matter movement and what they think universities should be doing in response to this. I think it's really important to say that none of us are trying to talk for people. We're just representing the findings from the diverse students we've spoken to. And we really thought it's the job of marketers to listen to their audiences and tell their stories to make change and impact. And we really have the power to do that. And it's our job to communicate and represent all the diverse people who study at our institutions. So this webinar and discussion roundtable, we're going to try and keep it as conversational as we can. We'll hopefully give you some insights into what students are saying when it comes to university marketing, and practical things you can actually do back at your institutions to make your advertising not only more diverse, but more inclusive. So Cass is going to be covering specific data points on student perceptions of the institution as a whole. And Charlie's going to be talking about how this translates into action the marketing team can take to overcome perceived barriers to entry at university. We're then going to have some questions and answers at the end. Now, to set the scene, we've got some of the headline figures we found in the research. And I, for one, I've worked in university marketing for 8+ years, background in student unions and representing student views to universities and the wider country. And some of these statistics for me were quite shocking. So 6 in 10 students don't feel represented by the advertising that universities use. 7 in 10 students are more likely to buy from brands who represent them, and successful brands are more likely to have diversity and inclusion, not only in their advertising, but in their institution. And we then asked students through free text to let us know the typical person that they were used to seeing in adverts themselves. And we have some really obvious recurring characteristics, such as their body type. So the words skinny, slim, thin, their appearance, so beautiful, attractive, perfect skin, and things like their ethnicity, predominantly white. And I think we can all relate to seeing these types of people in a lot of the adverts that we see. And is this really representative of students, of the US population? Absolutely not. And with this disjoint being evident in universities and colleges, we're going to be discussing what needs to be done that communicates diversity without being tokenistic or topical. So I think Cass is going to kick us off today to cover off two of the findings that relate to the institution as a whole. And Cass, me and Charlie are going to jump in with different questions, and hopefully we'll have some good conversations. And again, if anybody has any questions throughout, please feel free to ask them and we'll get to them at the end.
Perfect. Thank you, Murray. Yeah, so our first finding is all about virtue signalling. So let's go into some of the data. So our research told us that 10% of students said that they'd never seen a real person in advertising. And by real, here we're talking about not like a typical model, showing that students are not really seeing authenticity in adverts. But students really want this. They really want to see real people. They want to see people like them in advertising and in marketing that universities and brands use. But as Murray said, this shouldn't be a token effort. Students told us they've seen some brands now starting to post seemingly natural content with Black models. However, if you scrolled back in their feeds, there wouldn't be any faces of colour on their feed until the Black Lives Matter movement. Similarly, one student recalled how a fashion retailer is now posting Black models, but only liked Black models. When companies are pledging millions of dollars to the Black Lives Matter causes, while obviously students are really happy that any donations are welcome, the students really hope to see some of that money invested back into the company's culture to train staff on diversity and inclusion, ensuring that the issues are fixed and it's not just these outside aesthetics that we're focusing on. And this is also how students feel about the people they interact with on your campuses, your staff, your faculty. So do your mentors, your counsellors, your staff really reflect your diverse student population? One student recounted how one counsellor signposted as racial support wasn't Black themselves, so they could not relate or support their specific needs. Quite often in marketing, we start talking about targeting criteria like age or gender when trying to reach out to prospective audience. And we then often forget about who these people are, their feelings and their emotions, and how these are the things that really drive their decisions. So we ask students how they feel when they see people that look like them in advertising. And overwhelmingly, and I think unsurprisingly here, students felt really positive about this. They felt included. They felt like they were part of something, like you're really bringing them in. The other key feeling that evokes in students is feeling motivated. So this is not just a positive emotion here, but one with really action behind it, going on to engage with you further and take the actions that you really want them to. So your institution needs to talk to the students. Don't just post generic content because you think it's the right thing to do. And maybe maybe that is the right thing to do, but really to understand from the people, from the students themselves, what they want, what changes need to be made so your actions are not just skin deep, but that you're really striving towards inclusivity through everything that you do, that you say, and that you show. But I think what Charlie's going to go through now is how we can really put this into practice.
Coming to terms with who you are and how you feel you can speak to or for others. It's the nature of things. You are most likely to be in a majority group, and it's all the things you are not that can stand in the way of you making meaningful change. What you want to be able to do as a marketer is to position your institution as open, as welcoming, as inclusive, as diverse, and as a place that anybody, no matter what community they align themselves to, can feel at home and feel like they belong to. But yeah, I think it's incredibly difficult. It's one thing to say that, it's a very difficult thing to actually do that and to overcome that point of view of feeling, well, if I'm going to, let's say, audit our creative assets, if I'm going to audit our image library, audit our video library, and then make efforts to improve those things in terms of making them more diverse and making them more representative, am I being tokenistic? And I think that the answer is simply that if it comes from a place of positioning your institution as the sort of institution which you want to be and which you can be, and position yourselves as welcoming and open, then no, it's not tokenistic. And as long as you do that with the intention of really showing what sort of an environment you've created, it will speak to people.
So Charlie, on that, we had a lot of institutions come to us to be honest, all year round, it's not just with the Black Lives Matter movement, but a lot of them are asking, you know, what content should they be posting, even around things like LGBT events, trans awareness rights, Black Lives Matter. And quite often it's kind of themed around a specific day of the year, right? And I think even looking at the research findings Cash just showed, some of it was seen as disingenuous. So we saw some institutions use the black squares in June, and others post around turning their lights off in solidarity for various movements. Some of these did get a huge backlash on social media. Why do you guys think this is?
I think most institutions that I kind of saw activity from, I guess, had the best intentions, but what they were posting or what they were talking about didn't come across as authentic. And students are going to stand up for this. As we said earlier, like, students do see through this stuff. They will look back, they'll see everything else that you've done, and they'll check if that post matches to kind of how you would normally talk about these things. So yeah, I feel like some of these actions came across more as just skin deep and a bit of a token with no real meaning or actions behind it. Whereas if maybe they'd posted that square and then they'd said, we're going to do X, Y, and Z to try and combat any level of like uninclusion or anything in the institution, then I think that would come across as more meaningful. But where it's just the black square, what does that mean? And the students are going to see straight through that.
I think coming back to that point around authenticity that you said there, because I think that's absolutely it. And authenticity is about, yes, it's about actions and it's about being representative of who you are, but it's being honest about all the things that you are not, and what your shortcomings are, what your failings are. You know, being transparent, being upfront. This is the time to be open and honest. And it was the institutions, when we saw, you know, how the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black Squares were engaged with, it was the institutions that approached it with that kind of, you know, that kind of lens, that actually, look, this is what we're trying to do. This is what we've failed to do in the past, but we're trying to be better. And this is how we're trying to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like on this point, it's not just about confronting your own privilege, it's about confronting your institution and how they are treating people differently, which I think we'll probably get onto a little bit later on. But it's so hard as a marketer, you know, a lot of things are done with the best of intentions. And as a marketer, you can't change your institution, you know, from its fundamental, you know, core setup, but there's definitely the right questions that can be asked internally to help identify where good things are happening, and hopefully push those forward more and more. And I know when we spoke to students as part of this research, you know, that a lot of the students we spoke to are really happy for us to ask them questions, but they do expect us to have done some education ourselves. Okay, so that was finding number 1, all about virtue signalling. Let's move on to number 2.
Thank you. Yep. So finding number 2 is around words mattering, which we know that anyway, but just some data that backs this up. So this finding is looking a bit more at the big picture. So understanding whether students feel represented in the marketing that they see. And from our studies, we found that almost 1 in 5 students told us they never felt represented in advertising specifically aimed at students. So it's specifically aimed at their like demographic, their audience group, but they still don't feel represented even by this. And I found this number really quite high, and I'm sure quite a lot of you listening to this will find that really high as well. And when we break this down into specific segments, we know that those with a disability were the least likely to feel represented. And students who are part of the LGBTQ+ community are also much less likely to feel represented as well. So I know we've spoken quite a lot about race and ethnicity, which is obviously really key, but it's thinking about all those different groups here as well. So what does that 1 in 5 mean? Well, there's roughly 19.9 million college students in the US. So this would mean that almost 4 million students don't feel represented in our advertising ever, which is just huge. That's such a big number. And there's definitely some positive change that we can all work on there together to make this better. And we also reviewed the specific areas of students' identities that they felt were underrepresented. And we found that less than 1/3 of students feel that their ethnicity or nationality is represented in the adverts that they see as well. And it's not just what students are seeing, but it's the words that universities and colleges are using. It's about the words used to talk about ethnicity, about who is talking and about what they're actually saying. Black students told us they don't want to be referred to as an acronym combined with other minority ethnicities. Acronyms such as BIPOC, that are used to represent students from all different backgrounds, different experiences, different cultures. And what's true for a Black student is not necessarily true for an Asian student, for example. And students felt like categorizing them in these kind of ways really took away from their identity. And therefore we were talking about things that maybe weren't necessarily true specifically for them. So institutions need to take a step back, really talking to your students who feel underrepresented or excluded. And what do they want? And how do they want to be communicated with? Students really want institutions to focus on inclusivity, not just diversity. So how can you make them feel like they're more a part of the institution and making meaningful changes to how the institution is run, all the way from the adverts that you depict your college, which you'll be in a lot more control over, to talking to students to improve the resources for them or the processes and how the institution is set up as a whole. The words you use are just as powerful as the images. So students really want to make sure that everything has inclusion at its heart, and it just feels authentic and true for them. So how can you start doing this from a more practical standpoint when it comes to your marketing?
Thanks, Cass. I think, this is not just an aesthetic problem. It's not a problem that can be solved just by fixing what your image assets look like or what your video assets look like. I think this really is all about digging deep and getting in amongst your students, really like getting into the institution, getting into the vibrance and the diversity and everything that's happening, using all the tools at your disposal, podcasts, articles, blogs, everything to really take the time to speak to students, to see those students, to listen to their experience and to give it a platform. It again can, like my point previously, I think can seem like an insurmountable task to try to give everybody a platform or to represent every community or micro community that there is, all of the diversity that there might be at your institution. But I think it's not about that. It's about showing what kind of an institution you are by the way that you give the space to individuals to speak of their own experience and to really show that what you've got at your institution is this beautiful, brilliant collective of diverse individuals from all kinds of cultures and all kinds of communities and all kinds of backgrounds. But you can't do that just through the images that you use in advertising.
Great. I was going to ask you guys a question actually on this. So I think the difference of diversity and inclusion is something that I think a lot of institutions don't think about enough. And I think we saw, especially this year, most institutions in their advertising talking about how diverse they are rather than how inclusive they are. Cass, do you mind just getting into a bit more detail on the differences between this and why it's important?
Yeah, it's probably something we should have spoken about earlier as well. It would have been helpful. So diversity is more about the what. So what is the makeup of your current student cohort? It could be it's very diverse or not so much diverse at all, but it's much more focused on demographics and stats. And it's normally where people have goals around them. So you might, for instance, have a diversity goal at your institution to increase the number of disabled students or from a certain ethnicity or for a certain background or level of like privilege and everything. So it tends to be much more the demographics, the stats. It's actually who's on your campus. Whereas inclusion is more about how you nurture this diverse community. So what actions and measures are you putting into place to ensure that that diversity really like thrives? How does it grow? And that all people of all identities feel included, they feel listened to, and you've got those processes in place for this kind of culture, I guess, as opposed, so it's more like the how as opposed to the what. And students are aware of this. So thinking back to the research we did with the Black Lives Matters movement, one student said to us that it's super easy for a university to just tick a few boxes to hit that like quota, make them feel like they're really doing a good job, which is part of it for sure. But that facilitating that real inclusion just isn't really focused on, or they didn't feel like it was focused on at their like institution specifically. So there is very much a difference between those two things, and inclusion is kind of what we're aiming for. That's the gold standard. But yeah, it takes a while to get there, and it's very institution wide and working together to really achieve that.
Charlie, do you have a final point you wanted to go through?
Yeah, and it's only a small point really, but I think it's really important because we're talking a lot about kind of actions and plans and what you can do. But I think one of the most important things is about being open, you know, and being willing, ready, and able to respond to what's happening both out in the world and what's happening at your institution. So it's one thing to go and find stories and to create a content plan around that. It's quite another thing to plan with a view to what might happen in the future that we don't know about yet, or where might stories come from, and being able to kind of act quickly on that, to be able to respond, to go and speak to the right people, and to be able to give those stories a platform with a view to really giving that right now view on this is what's happening at our institution.
So thanks everyone for submitting their questions. I'm going to start off with the first one. So have you seen any universities do anything interesting or inspiring to address the lack of diversity in marketing and branded comms? So Charlie, Cass, any thoughts on that?
Yes, I can speak on that one if that's all right, Cass. I think, yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of interesting endeavours happening in the space. One really recent, really notable example is yesterday I was really privileged to be invited to an event that NYU put on, a storytelling summit all focused around diversity and representation in their marketing efforts. And in you know, the purpose was trying to appeal to a more representative sort of cross-section of society. And it was an amazing thing. It was a 2-hour online sort of seminar, and it featured people from across the organization, from academic staff, support staff, you know, people tasked with you know, kind of marketing and communications and all sorts, and also had the author and so author in residence James McBride speaking about his experience, which was an incredible and really inspiring thing, and I thought a very brave thing and quite a visionary thing to be doing, really, to be trying to tackle the challenge in such a sort of positive, upfront and open way, rather than kind of behind closed doors and not wanting to speak about it in public. It was very public, and it looked sort of back at what they hadn't done in the past and look forward at what one could do in the future, and featured people really speaking about their own experiences in a very authentic way. It was brilliant.
Right. Cass, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Not like specifically to do with like marketing or branding, but more about what universities are doing in general to try and improve diversity and inclusion across their campuses. So I saw the other day some universities in Canada were recruiting like specific admissions boards that were focused on minority students, and then recruited and reviewed by minority people. So trying to make sure that actually we're looking at things a lot fairer, and that everyone is being reviewed fairly in that situation to try and get into university in the first place, which is one of the biggest hurdles.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And we also had a question specifically about the slide that spoke about students wanting to see real people, and someone's asked, what does a real person look like?
I think this is like quite hard, and I think my interpretation of this, and based on the responses we saw from the students, was more around someone who looked like them, someone they could identify with. It didn't have to look or be exactly like who they are, but someone who they felt shared some of their identities. I think is from what like the students were telling us is what they were really looking for here, and not like, as you said earlier, a skinny, slim, white, blonde person, which isn't representative of most people that you're going to see on your campuses.
I think that the other thing as well, which I think is really interesting about this is, I mean, you know, a real person looks like anyone, and I think that it's actually, when you get into it, is potentially less about just who is featured in your advertising, who is featured in advertising in general, but is more around the approach to advertising and how people's experiences and stories are reflected through content and through communications. Because if what you do is a sort of a very aesthetic thing, you know, and is images and doesn't get into anybody's personal stories in any way, doesn't give a platform to who they are beyond just what they look like, then, well, I mean, you know, they're just, you're just seeing them for what they look like, as opposed to the person and all the experiences and all the things that they bring with them instead, which is a much richer and much more interesting story to tell. So I think it's in one part who you're speaking to and who you're featuring, but it's also what tools and communications you're using to actually give those stories a platform.
I think we might have lost Murray. And we've got 3 minutes left, so should we do one more question? So we've got a question here, which Charlie, I think is going to be probably best for you. And it's probably quite hard as well, but do you measure the impact of advertising on diversity and admissions, or any results that you can kind of show from the work that we've done so far?
So it's a hard one, I think, and something that I would love to say that I'd sort of seen more advertising campaigns specifically focused around kind of making an impact on diversity in admissions. What I can speak about, I think, is around advertising performance, media performance, you know, campaign performance around diversity and representation in advertising. And, you know, over the last 6 to 9 months, we've seen a number of campaigns which have made a real effort to feature a much more diverse range of students. We've seen a notable example is a campaign for a university in the UK very recently, where there was a great number, proportionally, of disabled students, of physically disabled students with disabilities featured in the content. And it was engaged with so positively. It saw huge numbers of engagements and performed really, really strongly. Didn't see the kind of, you know, any kind of negative you know, interaction with it at all, actually, and was an extremely successful campaign in terms of, you know, engagement and actually getting people through to site and performing important actions. So I think, you know, looking just at sort of some advertising examples, yes, I think, you know, if done in the right way, done sensitively, done with a positive intention, and that's obvious, and as I say, stories and things are platformed as well, then yes, you know, seen some really positive performance.
Great. Sorry, my internet went off, so I'm back now. So I think we've got probably time for one more. So someone's asked if we're planning on running this research again, obviously because things have changed a lot in the world, to see how things have changed over time.
That's probably quite a quick one we can answer before our time runs out. Yes, I think we will be looking to run this again. So much has happened in the last couple of months, let alone what's going to happen probably throughout the whole of this year, that I think it's really important. And we also want to try and measure positive change. So hopefully the more we talk about this, the more we'll see universities, colleges adopt more diverse and inclusivity throughout their marketing, throughout their institutions, throughout their advertising. So yeah, we're hoping to see positive change when we next run a similar survey.